I'd like to take just a few moments of your time this morning to discuss a topic that I believe is very important to be studying in this day and age, and that is men's God-given role. God's role that he has given to men, specifically males, of course. And what we're going to talk about next week in the first sermon is going to be God's roles that he has given to women. But we're going to specifically talk this week about the men's role that they have been given by God. And of course, in this society, it's very important that we study this. There's been movements such as the feminist movement, the women's liberation movement, that want these equal rights, that want to be equal, and that's a good thing. I want to put a disclaimer before I begin this sermon that I am not saying in any way that women, especially in this country politically, should not have the same equal rights as men, equal pay, equal job opportunity. I think all of those things are good. And as we go through this sermon, I think you'll find that the scriptures even agree that men are not better than women. And that's not at all what I'm trying to say. Excuse me. Not what I'm trying to say through this sermon, but rather we still need to be studying the roles that God has given to men and women because they are very different. And there are things that God has put in place for men that he did not put in place for women, and vice versa, out of his own wisdom. And as we study through these things, I think each and every one of us, if we know a little bit about the opposite gender, we will recognize why these things are out of wisdom, and these things affect families greatly. We need to be studying them. Women in today's world and the teachings that go on in these feminist movements want to take upon themselves exactly the same role that historically and traditionally men have carried on. And what this does is it leaves many men of our time confused about what it is that they are supposed to provide or what it is that they are supposed to do for their relationships and for their family. And as we mentioned, women are not inferior to men, but they do have a different role. Men are not inferior to women, but they do have a different role. No man can be a mother. No woman can be a father, no man can be a wife, and no woman can be a husband. There are responsibilities involved with each one of those positions that simply cannot be fulfilled by the opposite gender. And so we need to know what our roles are in our homes, what our roles are in our marriages, in our relationships. What does God expect from us? And this role that has been given to men that we're going to discuss this morning is not something that comes simply from customs or traditions that this country has in place. Or you think, a lot of people say, well, that's an old-fashioned viewpoint. That's not the way marriages work anymore. That's not the way relationships work anymore. That's an old-fashioned way of thinking. I hear that all the time. But you know what? That's not where this comes from. And it also doesn't come from an idea prompted by male chauvinism or what they call toxic masculinity. Meaning, if you are acting as a man and you are being a man and fulfilling the role of the man, that is toxic to everybody around you because it's so obvious that you're trying to be a man that it's just off-putting. But you see, I'm not suggesting that men are these people in cut-off t-shirts and lots of tattoos with big muscles, walking around talking all mean and tough with their chest poked out, that can lift big, heavy things. That's not what a man is from the scriptures. But men are given different roles than women, and this is not by custom, tradition, or chauvinism. It is by divine, God-given origin. And so these things are something that we really need to consider. The headship of a man is given as a role by God. Man is to have this headship over the woman. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and in verse 3, it says, "But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." It's very clearly stated here in Paul's explanation of this hierarchy that Christ, of course, is the head of every man. But then when it comes down to men, it says men are head, or man is head over woman. And the head of Christ, of course, is God. So he goes through this hierarchy, and it's very easy for us to understand. Now, there needs to be more study done than just to say, well, the man's head over the woman, so I'm her boss, she does whatever I say, and she better not she better not talk back to me about any of those things. We're going to find out that's not how this works either. But in 1 Timothy chapter 2, the same point is made there again by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the young evangelist Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 11, he says, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control." So the Apostle Paul says here that he does not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now, a lot of people say, well, that was their culture, that was their custom. Women were treated poorly, and these feminist movements, these equal rights movements, would absolutely despise this passage and this statement by the Apostle Paul. Even to the point where they don't hide it, they don't believe in the Scriptures, and they don't like the Scriptures because they say it's an extremely sexist book. I've read that so many times, heard that so many times, that the Scriptures in the Bible, God's Word, is a very sexist book. And that's so sad because they're missing the entire point of men and women in Scriptures. It's not that one is better than the other, but women, it says, are not to have authority over men, not because of customs, not because of traditions, but for two reasons. The first reason, he says in verse 13, because Adam was formed first, then Eve. This is by God's creation. Of course, we know God created Adam, and then he created Eve. Look in the book of Genesis, at Genesis chapter 2, and in verse 7. It says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed." We go a little bit further to verse 18. And it says, "And the Lord God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." Down in verse 23. It says, "And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." What we see here from this account in Genesis chapter 2, of course, the account of the creation of man, Adam was formed. He looks around at all the beasts of the field, and what does he see? None of them were compatible and good enough to be the helper that Adam needed as his mate. So what did God do? Out of the rib of Adam, he created woman. He created Eve, and that was to be done so that he would have a helper that was comparable to him. Notice the words used here as he needed a helper, right? God created him a helper. Why? Because Adam alone, on his own, was not going to be able to do what God expected of him to do. One, they had to repopulate the earth. Two, man alone, I think everybody knows, if you stick a bunch of men in a room together, there's something that's lacking that a woman would provide, right? That feminist, or that feminine quality that women can bring to families, to parenting, to churches, to anything. Women are very beneficial in the picture. Adam needed this helper, and God created him. But as Paul mentioned, Adam was created first, and then Eve. The second reason that women are not to have authority over men is found in verse 14 of this passage in 1 Timothy chapter 2. It says there in verse 14, "And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression." Well, you think, well, no, because Adam sinned as well. Adam ate of the fruit just as Eve ate of the fruit. But you see, there was a distinct difference in Eve's sin and Adam's sin, and that was that Eve was deceived by the serpent to think that eating of this fruit was going to make her like God. Adam did not have this deception. Adam ate of the fruit, took of his wife, and he was punished for that, as we read later on in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, just as Eve and the serpent were punished. But you see, Adam was not deceived in the way that Eve was deceived by the serpent. If we go to Genesis chapter 3 and we look at verse 4, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 4, it says, "Then the serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. And it says the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. And so you see what happens is the serpent, of course, as we know, deceives Eve, and she takes of the fruit for many reasons. It was good to the eye. It was good for food. It was desirable to make one wise. She was deceived by the serpent to think that this was a good thing. And we know from 2 Timothy chapter 2 that Adam was not deceived that way, the same way that Eve was deceived. For these two reasons, Paul says women are not to have authority over the men. What this means is men have been given this headship by God. This also applies in a family setting. And what we're going to mostly spend our time on this morning is looking at men in a family, whether that be a marriage relationship or even as a father. In Ephesians chapter 5, we find a lot of teaching here in this section of the Ephesian letter toward families, fathers, mothers, wives, husbands. But in chapter 5 and verse 22 of the book of Ephesians, it says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, also Christ is head, as also Christ is head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." Just as Christ is head of the church, it says that the man or the husband is supposed to be head of the wife. This means that the husband takes on a lot of the same responsibility that Christ and the same love that Christ showed to the church. And that's what he says. You are to the wives are supposed to submit to their husbands, but the husbands are to love their wives just as Christ loved the church. Look at, again, the book of 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in verse 4. It says, "One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God?" Of course, in this context of 1 Timothy chapter 3, he's going over the qualifications for one to be an elder of a local congregation. And one of these qualifications, of course, we understand why this would be a qualification for an elder. He says he has to be one who rules his own house well. His children have to be in submission with all reverence to him. They have respect for him. They have reverence towards him. They look up to him. They view him as that authority figure. Now, a lot of men don't have this in their families. A lot of times men are not looked at as the authority figure in their families. Their children despise them. Their children do not want to listen to them. They don't respect them at all. Their wives don't respect them at all. They always go against what they have to say, and you can tell in that home there is no leadership involved from that man. This is a qualification for an elder, like it says in verse 5. If a man can't rule his own house, how's he going to take care of the church of God? If he can't even get it right inside of his roof, then how in the world is he supposed to fulfill the task of an elder in taking care of the local congregation when they're spread out in all of their own homes? And so a man is to be this head of the family. He is supposed to rule his house well. His children are supposed to be in submission to him. He is supposed to be the head, the leader of that family, but this must be done correctly. A lot of men take this and say, you know what, that's right, I'm putting the iron fist down on this family, and I am bossing them around, and I'm going to make sure it's my way or the highway for my family. And they better be listening to me no matter what. Right? That's not how this is to be done. This is to be done correctly. It's to be done with understanding and honor toward their wives. In 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 7. It says, "Husbands likewise dwell with them," talking about their wives, "with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered." The advice given here by the Apostle Peter says, husbands, you are to dwell with them with understanding. You're to understand their roles, right? And we're going to talk about that next week as far as what the roles to women are by God. But men are supposed to understand their role in things. Women are supposed to understand the man's role. And that's why this is such an important lesson, whether you're a woman, a wife, a mother, or whether you're a husband, father, man. These things have to be understood by the opposite party. It says that we are to give honor to our wives as the weaker vessel. Now, what does that mean? A lot of women, if they hear that verse, they say, "What do you mean the weaker vessel? I'll show them I'm not weaker." And that might sound a little funny, a little facetious, but that's not. It's something that is truly believed by a lot of women. I'm not weaker in any way. If they would do a little bit of study looking into what Peter meant by this weaker vessel, he's talking about a vessel that would be to carry liquid or food, a fine china. And we recognize with fine china the amount of care and the amount of respect that we have to give it. One is something that is beautiful and delicate, but also something that is to be displayed and to be proud of, right? How many times do you see in people's houses that their fine china sets are just put away in the garage somewhere inside of a box taped up? Most of the time what you'll find is they have a beautiful piece of carpentry woodwork with a glass front to display this fine china because it's that precious. And I remember when my wife and I were moving out of our house in Bethany to come up here, we were loading up the moving truck, and I picked up a box from the kitchen, and it said, "Great Grandma's Fine China." And I thought, I better put this down because I'm going to be the one that breaks this box, and I'll be in big time trouble. And so I put it right down, and I let her carry it out later. But that amount of care, that amount of respect for something that is so beautiful needs to be taken care of in that way. And that's what Peter's talking about here as honoring the weaker vessel, as something that is delicate and fragile but beautiful and should be respected that way. And it says the reason why you should have this type of attitude to your wife and what you should be thinking on in this is that you are heirs together of the grace of life. You are heirs of that grace that has been given to you by God to share in one another's marriage, and also the grace that's been given for the salvation of your sins, that you're on the same road to heaven, and that you are the helper to the other one for that. It says that your prayers may not be hindered. That's how serious this is. You want your prayers to be heard by God, you treat your wife right. And that might not be a line of comparison that we draw all the time, that, well, my prayers are being hindered because I'm not treating my wife right. That's not something we might think of. But it's something that we should. Peter makes the comparison there. It's also to be done in a way that is not bitter or harsh or mean. And a lot of times, especially for men who have stronger personalities, this is something that they have to battle. This is something that for me personally, I have to battle sometimes to make sure that the way I am doing this, the way I am leading my family is not in a way that's mean. Sometimes I don't even mean for it to be, right? And I'm sure we can all relate to that. There have probably been times we didn't mean to be mean, but we have really upset our spouse, right? These are things we need to take care of. In Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 19. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 19, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, and do not be bitter toward them." We don't be bitter towards them. We don't be harsh. We don't be mean. We need to be understanding, loving, and honor her as the possession that is most precious to us. That's how a man should be heading up his household. But that headship that God has given him carries great responsibility for a man. And some would say that this responsibility is even greater than the responsibility that the wife has, but I don't know if I would go that far to say that. I think both have a responsibility equally as important, because if you take one role out, then the marriage or the relationship is lacking that part. And a lot of times they fail. But when we talk about men specifically, many homes sadly fail because the man has failed to lead. The husband and the man of the house, the father, has failed to lead his family. The marriage fails because that man fails to maintain that leadership, whether he's trying to maintain that leadership or not. He fails at it. Sometimes this can happen because he is bitter, because he is mean, because he is bossy, and he never wants to hear anything from any other side. It's my way or the highway. A lot of times it fails because of that. You lose respect in those types of cases. It fails because he doesn't guide or protect his family in the scriptures. He is, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, to be the spiritual leader of the family. But leadership, you see, is earned. And this is something that through my entire life playing sports and being on sports teams, and even through my father's teaching and and even studying the scriptures growing up, and now I've recognized this point to be more and more true every time I witness something relating to this. Leadership is earned. You lead by example. And if you are not willing to live the way that you expect the people that you are leading to live, then you are never going to be a successful leader. When you look at Jesus and the way that he was a leader, what kind of example did he set for his followers? The exact example that he was telling them that they should live in. You can't look at Jesus' life and say, you know what? He says to do this and he says to do that and he says how important it is for us to live this way, but look at his life. He's obviously not as concerned about it as he says that we should be. You can't say that about Jesus Christ. His example that he left was exactly in line with what he taught for others to be living. And so we need to understand, even in our homes, this is true. We are to lead our homes as Christ led the church, to love our wives as Christ loved the church. How did he do that? By setting the example that he wanted them to follow. Think about on a sports team, you have a captain, or on a football team, you have a quarterback or the defensive captain, most of the time a middle linebacker of some sort. What is special about that position? Because really, on the field, it's just another position. Everybody has a role to play, right? Everybody does their job, and especially if you've ever been involved in any kind of football type thing, you'll recognize the play that's supposed to be run involves all 11 people. And if all 11 people are not doing exactly what they're supposed to do, the play fails. The defense wins. So what's special about the one position that is set aside to be the leader of that team? What is special about being the captain of that team? Because you are the leader. You're the one that everybody else is looking to. You're the one that encourages everybody to do the right thing. But you can't ever have a successful team if the leaders on that team are expecting things out of the rest of their teammates that they're not willing to do themselves. The same thing is true in terms of being a husband or being a father. You might be saying the right things. You might be encouraging your family to go down in the right directions, as spiritually or any other thing that you might feel is necessary. But yet you yourself are not setting that example. You're not leading by example. You're just leading with words. And you'll never be respected in that way. There was one team I played on when I was in high school, when I played soccer a lot. And the coach pulled me aside and he wanted me to be the captain of that team. And I thought, well, I'd never really been a captain before. I, don't really want to do that. But he said, this is what I have decided. You're going to be the captain of this team. Well, what's hard about that is the team did not choose me to be that captain. The coach did. And so how in the world am I going to lead that team? How am I going to be the example for that team if they don't respect me as that leader? As a husband in a family, you have to earn the respect of your wife. You have to earn the respect of your children to allow them to follow your lead. They are not going to follow your lead if they do not respect you as the leader. And the only way that you can achieve that is by doing so with your own actions, by leading by example. That leadership of the house is earned. Yes, that headship is given by God. And yes, that might be of divine origin, but your family's never going to accept that or live that way unless you earn that respect. In Ephesians chapter 5 and in verse 25, the way that we do this, of course, like we said, is by living a good example. But in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25, we also see it says, husbands, love your wife, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. And we'll pick up where we left off last time in this passage. And it says that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies, and he who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. Do you see the comparison that's being made here in the book of Ephesians by the Apostle Paul? Is the husband being the head over the wife as Christ is head over the church. So the same way that Christ respects and loves and cherishes his possession, the church, the husband is supposed to be that same way to his wife. He loves his wife as his own body, as Christ loved us and as he loves himself. Because nobody's, like he says, nobody hates his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, right? Is this the way that we are leading our homes? Is this the way that we are trying to earn this respect from our wives and from our children? If the wives and children are just seeing you run around yelling all the time, getting mad because things aren't the way that you said they should be, then that respect is probably not going to be earned. They need to see you handle that situation with patience and love and poise, but to be firm and to stand your ground. I'm not saying that every time something serious, especially of a spiritual matter, is going in the opposite direction in your home, that you should just sit back and lay down and let that happen. That is not the role of a man in the home. The man needs to stand firm and put a stop to those things, but it needs to be done with love and patience and kindness. Something that honestly sometimes goes against a lot of the natural instinct for men to act. And like we've mentioned a couple of times already, the man is to be the spiritual leader of that home. What a great responsibility that is put on a man, on a husband, on a father, to be the one that is supposed to look after his family spiritually. This is the most important role of a husband and of a father. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, it says, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but you are to bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord." This is your goal as parents, to bring your children up in the way that they should go, to teach them to admonish the Lord. What this means is that they respect the Lord. They understand him as the Savior and as God. And that can be a very hard thing, especially with children that have their own will. And a lot of times, even though the parent's done the right thing, the child still has that free will to make the decision to leave the church, and it happens quite often. But as a parent, your main responsibility in your home is to be the spiritual leader of that house. While they're in your roof, they will follow the Lord. And they might decide that after they're gone and after they leave home, they're not going to be that way anymore. But just like we mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 3 in talking about the qualifications for an elder, while they are in your home, they respect you as the leader of that home and they submit to you. That's what we should be striving for men, especially in a spiritual nature. But there are some pitfalls that we can get into, and the reason I call them pitfalls is because these can all be things that happen to us as we try to do the right thing, okay? We're trying to do what the scriptures say. We're trying to fulfill our responsibility and our role, but it doesn't always work. One pitfall you can get into is in-law problems. Has anybody else ever had to deal with in-laws that might have frustrated you? I have great in-laws. I don't mean to speak bad about them. And I know that my wife has the best in-laws in the world because they're my parents. No, I'm only joking. But what we understand is that in-laws can get in the way sometimes, right? They've been parents, they've been married for a lot longer, they have a special place for you in their heart, and so a lot of times they might see something happening and feel the need to step in, right? And then you have two families butting heads, or you have the wife siding with her parents, the husband siding with his parents, and you have 4 or 3 different families involved in one scuffle between you and your wife. These are things we really need to avoid. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 5, just as we saw in Genesis chapter 2 in the creation of man account, when it says that man is to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, Jesus says the same thing. He quotes this passage in Matthew chapter 19 verse 5, says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." When a man marries a woman and they become husband and wife, they have started a new family. It is separate from any family that they have ever had prior to that. And what we need to recognize is, though we might still love our parents and our siblings, and we might go to family get-togethers and enjoy the love that we have, I'm not saying that we should just leave them in the dust, and even if we love them, we just have to say, "I can't see you anymore." That's not the case. But what you have to understand is the issues that you might face between a husband and a wife are between the husband and the wife. The more a marriage relationship involves the in-laws, the worse it might become. Because Even though they love you, it's hard sometimes for them not to be biased toward their own child. And in my case, they're probably more biased toward Rose than they are toward me. They'll side with her immediately before they side with me, and I love that. But my point is, it's hard for them to really truly understand the real issue that you guys are dealing with. Because what happens, they're not there with you every day. They don't know what led up to this. They don't understand your family dynamic because it's going to be different than theirs. And so we need to avoid the pitfall of in-law problems. If it's something to where you are in danger, if it's something to where you have no one to turn to and you really, it's bad, then yes, your parents are there to love you. Yes, your in-laws are there to help you. But if it's just some scuffling, if it's one night that gets real bad, you start yelling, you get mad at each other, one call to the parent, one call to the in-law can really cause a lot more problems. And so we need to recognize you are a new family. And you, as a man, need to be leading your family in love and compassion and understanding to try to avoid those times when the rest of the family can get involved. And sometimes you're not even mad. Sometimes it's not a time where in-laws are called upon by one of the people in this relationship, but they feel like their opinion is needed inside of the relationship. There are a lot of families like this where you're doing just fine, your family's working, you're being the leader of your household, and everything is going the way that you'd have it to go, and then, they say, well, really, you ought to be doing this. Really, that's not the way that you should raise your kid. Really, this is the way that you should be doing that. Right? You can respect their advice, and you should consider their advice. But all in all, it is your family. And as the man of that family, you are called upon to be their leader. And it is your decision. You need to make sure that you are confident. Another pitfall you need to avoid as a man is infidelity. And really this goes both ways for the man and for the woman, for the husband and the wife. But sadly, a lot of times, marriages that are happy, marriages that are going well, end because of the cause of infidelity. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and in verse 1, it says, Now concerning the things which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except for the consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. You see, the husband and wife relationship was given also for the reason to prevent sexual immorality. As Paul says, it's better if a man can just refrain and not touch a woman at all. He says in verse 7, I wish that all men were even as myself, because Paul did not have these types of temptations that got a hold of him. He says, but each one has his own gift from God, and in this manner, one in this manner and another in that. So what he's saying is he wished that all men could just stay away, that we could be individual, because these types of things would end. But the fact is, because of sexual immorality, marriage is in place. A husband is to fulfill those desires with his wife. A wife is to fulfill those desires with her husband. What happens when you deprive one of them from those physical needs? Because we are all adults here for the most part, and we recognize that, yes, people do have those needs. It's a real thing. It's not something that we need to just keep locked up inside of us and not tell anybody about. We have those feelings. We have those needs. What happens when you deprive them from it? Now, I'm not saying that now it is your fault that your spouse has gone and cheated on you. That's not what I mean. But what I do mean is that you can be a part of that temptation being there for them, because they don't know if they're going to receive those needs from you. And so Paul says you don't deprive one another of each other's needs. You help each other in this manner to prevent this pitfall of infidelity. That you can stay loyal to one another, and that your family can continue forever the way that God intended it to. Another thing that a lot of times happens in a relationship, a marriage relationship, is that people resent the other one eventually. You live together every day. You sleep in the same bed every day. You wake up in the same house every day. You're around each other all the time. And as we know, a lot of times that can lead to a little bit of a resentment feeling toward the other one. Oh my goodness, there she is again. Or, oh, there he comes again, making noise when I'm trying to sleep in a little bit. Whatever it might be, you kind of have these types of resentment feelings. How can a man prevent this pitfall from happening in his relationship? Well, first of all, you love and lead by example. You are not her boss. When you look at a little bit of an illustration, I found this illustration online from James S. Hewitt. I don't know who he is or what he's about, but that's who wrote this illustration. It says, a tyrannical husband demanded that his wife conform to rigid standards of his choosing. She was to do certain things for him as a wife, mother, and homemaker. In time, she came to hate her husband as much as she hated his list of rules and regulations. Then one day, he passed away. Sometime later, she fell in love with another man and married him. She and her new husband lived on a perpetual honeymoon. Joyfully, she devoted herself to his happiness and welfare, and one day she ran across one of the sheets of do's and don'ts her first husband had written for her. To her amazement, she found that she was doing for her second husband all the things that her first husband had demanded of her, but she was joyfully doing them as an expression of her love for him and her desire to please him without even realizing it. You see, this illustration, and I'm not saying this is true 100% of the time in 100% of the cases, but it is a wonderful illustration of this idea of leading by love and by example and not being her boss. You're not her boss. You're not her coach. You are her spouse. You are her husband. And as hard as this might be, especially if things aren't going the way that you expect them to be, it's easy to put the foot down and say, all right, here's my list. And you're going to do this, and you're not going to do this, and this is my family, and you will listen to me. Do you know what position that puts her in? Because as we'll talk about next week, one of her major roles is submitting to her husband. Do you know what kind of position that puts her in when she feels the need to submit to her husband, but this is the way that she is commanded by her husband to do it? That's so sad for somebody to be put in that type of situation. Excuse me. To be put in that type of situation, but it happens all the time. We are to lead by love and by our example. We are not her boss. And even if you do become to be a boss of a company someday where you can sit back in a chair and you can direct what everybody else is doing, you are still not going to be a successful boss. Your company's not going to be successful. Your employees will resent you if you're just sitting there going, rah, 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 go do this, go do that, instead of leading by example. We still need to make sure this is happening. We are not her boss. We love her and we respect her. This is the way that true leadership can exist inside of a home. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 6, as we wrap this lesson to a close. Proverbs chapter 6, beginning there in verse 6. It says, Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall your poverty come upon you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in verse 8. It says, But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A man is to be a diligent worker. God gave him to work with his hands and to provide for his family off of the land. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you're not a farmer in today's culture, you're a sinner because you're not providing from the land. That's not what I mean. But you are to be a diligent, hard worker. You are not to let your family fall into these things and this level of poverty because of your laziness. Now, sometimes it happens. I'm not saying, you look at a family who's poor and doesn't have anything, and you look at the husband and say, well, he's obviously failing what God expects of him to do. That's not the case either. But if he is lazy, if he is a sluggard, if he lays around, if he doesn't care about providing for his family, then yes, he's failing the leadership role of that home in God's eyes. We need to be diligent workers as men. Men provide for that family, as we talked about in Genesis 3:17 through 19. That was God's punishment to Adam for sinning, was that he was going to work with his hands and by the sweat of his brow provide for his family. We are also to promote love and happiness. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and in verse 39, it says, "A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord." This relationship that we have as a married couple should be a relationship that lasts until we die. And that's something that a lot of people do not hold to in today's world. 50% divorce rate tells you right now that people do not view this marriage vow with God to be something that should last forever and to be permanent. But that is exactly what the Bible teaches. So how is it that we can have love and happiness and joy and leadership for a lifetime? Well, we, again, be the spiritual leader of the house. If we are focused on the spiritual things in our home, if we are focused in leading our family to better follow and better submit and better exemplify Christ in our home, then these are not going to be issues we have to worry about. Because we ourselves will be living by that example. Our family will jump on board. They will follow your example. And your house will be filled with the love of Christ. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's the responsibility of a man. Let's look at two quick examples. One example is going to be good. One example is going to be bad. Look at what God said about Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. In Genesis chapter 18 and in verse 19, he says, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." What a wonderful thing for the Lord to say about a father, that he has confidence that his children and his household after, and their household after him, are going to be those who keep the way of the Lord and do righteousness and justice. That's the goal of a leader of this home. That's the goal of a man, for your household and even your children's household after you to keep the faith and to be submitted and to be submissive to the Lord. A bad example would be the speech that Saul gave to his son Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 20. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, beginning there in verse 30. It says, "Then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, "Why should he be killed? What has he done?" Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. If we go on to verse 41 and 42, we recognize that he was with David there warning him. But think about the example that Saul set to his son Jonathan in what he had said to him and what he had done. That was not a good example of a father. That was not somebody leading by example. But even Jonathan knew. He rose up the table in fierce anger, ate no food the second day of the month, and grieved for David. This is somebody who does not respect his father. Why? Well, because his father does not deserve his respect. And that's something that we need to look at as men. So in conclusion, we have to understand our role as men, and we have to do our best to fulfill it. Yes, we will mess up. No, we are not going to be perfect. No, we are not going to be Jesus Christ inside of our home. But we need to strive for that. We need to be doing everything we can every day to lead our home closer and closer to God, closer and closer to heaven. And we need to be doing that in love, not with an iron fist, not in anger, not with bitterness toward the rest of our family. The other thing we have to realize is that these are God-ordained roles. Women, I do not mean for this lesson to be demeaning in any way whatsoever, and neither do the Scriptures. They revere you and speak of you as something so precious and so fine and something that needs to be honored and respected because you are beautiful for how God made you. And that is 100% what the Scriptures teach us. These teachings are not demeaning, but they are wise in that they lead to a successful family. As we wrap up next week's lesson about the roles for women, we will really have the full idea and the full picture of why it is that women are supposed to do what they're supposed to do and men are supposed to fulfill their roles. There are very specific reasons why each has been given to the other. They lead to a successful family. You need to understand your husband's roles and help him to fulfill them. Don't make it hard on him to do his job. Try to make it easier. You can only do that if you understand what his job is. And these roles that God gave, they remain the same whether we follow them or not. Whether we agree with them or not, whether we want to believe them or not, that's what they are. These are divine originated roles that God has given to men and women. We don't get to change them, and there is great wisdom in it. There is great wisdom in why the man has been chosen to be the leader and why the woman has been chosen to do what she is to do for her family. Because women couldn't do this, and believe me, after next week, you'll understand men cannot do what they are supposed to do. There is great wisdom, and we need to follow the pattern. So many families today have gone so far from the biblical pattern of what a family is supposed to be, where a man is the head of his household, he is the spiritual leader, and he is to be respected based on his love and his example that he sets for his family. Now, right now, you have people at their homes, not attending services, not concerned with spiritual things, even though the man, he might have grown up in church. He might have grown up going to church. He might have grown up respecting God, but what happened? He married a woman who said that that's not important. He married a woman who said that's not how my family is going to be. And if you love me, then you better fall in line. And he did. He laid down and he fell in line. That's something that we as men need to be cautious of, because you think, how did that happen to that guy? You know, he was so faithful. He was so passionate until he married that woman, and now he fell away. Same thing happened to Solomon. The women in his life, the wives that he married, ruined his relationship with God. We need to be leaders of our family in love and example. The lesson's yours.